All right. Hi, everybody. It's October 1st, 2020. Beautiful day to be alive, I think. We're supposed to have a full moon tonight. So although we're having rainstorms here, so I don't know if we're going to get a chance to see it, but it's going to happen above the clouds if the clouds are here. And so that's what's up with today. So if you see me sweating, I told Donovan that here in Hawaii, before the rainstorm comes, it always heats up. And so you always get a nice sweat glistening on your forehead before the rain comes. And then you'll see me. I should have brought maybe a towel from the gym or something so I could wipe off. You guys would think I was really exerting myself to do the satsang. But anyway. I wanted to start just by kind of reviewing a little bit, because both of your questions, both are really interesting questions, and they actually weave into each other. So I'll start with those. But the path or the spiritual journey is one that is really confusing to a lot of people, and here's why. We start as consciousness. That's all we really are when we're a small child. The body is there, but they'll tell you, the experts, that at about a year and a half or two, you start to realize that you're actually separate from your mother. Until then, there is absolutely no sense of separation. And whenever that time is, you'll also notice that during that time that you're not verbal. And that should give you kind of a clue to where we're going to tread. So what happens is that we're taught that in order to be human and live in our world, that there's two things that likely need to happen. Number one is you have to believe that you are separate. In other words, there's no way you can teach a body-mind to do all of the things it's supposed to do without assuming it's separate. That's the assumption we make as humans. I'm not saying that's true. I think it's highly likely that you could teach folks without assuming they're separate, but that's the assumption we make. And then the other assumption we make is that as humans, that we are going to generate, and typically through verbal and spoken word or some kind of wording, we're going to generate meaning. That's the other assumption that we make. And meaning, if you think about it, is an exercise in separation. We talk a lot about what perception is, and it's looking out there and pulling something out of everything that is, and then highlighting that in typically a story. A story is the first way that we describe things when we're a child. We're taught to tell a story. And when you tell a story, it's always one. The story itself is separate because speaking has its own domain, apart from the pre-verbal and consciousness itself, where everything lives. And of course, the speaker's separate, the speaking is separate, and the story that's created can be separate. So what happens is that we identify ourselves based on the story. And that's our moment of misidentification, because we then believe that the story is reality. So hold on to that, because as I talk to you guys, I'm gonna go back into that, how the story is the reality. So we travel out from that, and actually we get into a huge process for most of us of what we call self-mastery, which means that we shiny and we really polish up that individual. Donovan is a world-class surfer. James and I are both businessmen, and so we were shaped. I went to accounting school. James went and got his MBA at UCLA. Donovan, you were out on the waves, but we were all shaped. We were shaped to basically be a certain way. And so that shaping is a continual pounding of story. That's what it is. In other words, it's here's who you are. Oh no, cut this piece off. Here's who you are. No, you're going to add this piece. Here's who you are. So not only do we conflate story with consciousness, right? We actually learn that we are the story itself. When we identify with the story, we leave consciousness behind. We wall ourselves off internally by creating a story and a belief that we are separate. So that world of everything is undefined that we actually inhabited in the beginning gets left behind. It's walled off from who we are. So the spiritual journey is a march back to that place. Now, a lot of times you'll hear me say, and other people say, hey, listen, consciousness is who you really are. I want you to know that the reason I do that is because that's the piece we left behind. So I'm really concentrating on that piece as an antidote or a solution or whatever, a way to see the world. The reality is, consciousness is both that undefined energetic of simply nothingness, and then all of what emerges out of it. It's all of that. So it includes this body mind. It also includes all that intellectual calculation and everything. But we've taken, and consciousness is very accommodating. So it's a funny thing. It doesn't have particularly a way of being other than how we use it. It's a tool. So when you say I'm a separate thing, consciousness goes, hey, works for me. That's what we are. And when you say, oh, there's no such thing as that undifferentiated pool of who you were and who you used to be, consciousness says, works for me, let's rock. And so that becomes the world that we move into. So what happens is that every now and then, someone will, in their pursuit, they'll feel internally that there's something missing. And that something missing is the sense of separation. Living in separation always will deliver to your intuition the sense that there's something wrong. There's something amiss here. There's something out of balance. Of course, you've moved away from your birthright of being connected to consciousness, if you will, or actually living within consciousness and being extruded. So that belief and story that you believe that you are walls you off from that. And there's an intuition going, hey, there's something wrong here. And then it is seen that you are consciousness itself, and you're not really the body mind. You're not the story that you think you are, but what you are is the perceiver, because that's what consciousness actually does. It perceives, right? And so, but you're not a perceiver as an Alan. That Alan perceiver is simply a story that we created. Remember, that's our story identity. But the perceiving that you are is perceiving as consciousness itself. So that's the perceiving of consciousness itself. And so now we're out there. What's the fix? We go back to that origination of consciousness. So that's the spiritual journey, is a trek back to a mistaken, reclaiming our error of that mistaken identity. I guess I'll call it an error. I don't want to judge it, because if you look at how it happens, it all works. So I'm always grateful for the journey, because it's that journey that brought it back. So, but the error or the mistake is just simply buying into what it was you were given when you first arrived into this place and you started to learn this is how it works, which happens everywhere. You go to a company that's different from another company and you're immersed into this is how it works. Well, the first this is how it works exercise that you did is when you were a child. And they said, oh, this is what you are, and this is the kind of being that you're going to become. And you're Alan, so that's your identity. And you inherit that particular blueprint at the very beginning. So that's the journey. The journey is back. So remember that, consciousness is this interesting thing. You enter from the side of the undifferentiated, right? And then the exit side is this story, right? So the output is the story. So the reason that we work with story is that the undifferentiated piece that's behind it is continuing to be undifferentiated, arising as consciousness, but we've locked into typically one story. So working with story in your intellect starts to basically give you an opportunity of seeing there's more than one story. The minute that you start to add stories and hold them all together, the dissolution of that fixed story begins. So working with those stories on this front end. So you're entering back. So you hit the story place, because people will ask you, they go, Alan, you tell me you're not the story. And yet you tell me you want to go back to your original myth story. The original myth story is the pure story of you, but it's the one that in the very beginning got fixed on. It's the one that said, this is all I am. And then it was added to become the story identity. So when you're on a spiritual journey, the journey back is to basically hit, the first thing you're going to hit is me as unidentified story. You're going to hit your story identity on the trip back. First thing you're going to hit. And then you're going to say, well, what do I do with that? Well, if you're using the approach that we're using, which is using your intellect to unwind your intellectual identifications, then we begin to work with that. And so that's why the devices that you hear from me are those kinds of devices. So I'm always working with story, knowing that we're not story, but knowing that if you can loosen that up, you can loosen that story definition up, that behind it lives undifferentiated consciousness. And the point is that once that starts to happen, the dissolution starts to happen and one falls into consciousness itself. Of course, the one that falls into consciousness itself is no longer a one, because the stories have been all jumbled up and dissolved. But that's the activity of doing what it is that we're doing, right? So if you're working with that, just notice that I use story as the birthright of where we start and what we're identified with, and then I also use it as the doorway, because I know we all hold a story called story identity of who we think we are, but we're not. And I want to get that dissolved to move into that last place. So story is important, but as a device, it's not who you are ultimately. So we're going to find your original myth story. We're going to find the place that you live, and then we're going to dissolve that so you can add the piece that's there. Now, remember one thing, consciousness, the reason that people, when they talk about awakening, they call it coming home. And the reason is because it's who you are, it's how you started, and it's always there even when you believe you've walled yourself off. I always kind of use the idea that it's like walking around with a $20 bill in your pocket that you forgot. And in this case, you probably, in the consciousness example, you probably even forgot you had a pocket. And then one day you reach in there and you go, man, son of a gun, they're $20. Huh, who knew? So here's one little pointer. Consciousness has you. In other words, you as an individual, you live within the nest of consciousness itself, right? So when you're thinking about your approach to consciousness, the you that you are will disappear before you get there. So when you're telling yourself, I need to basically acquire, or I need to find this place, you already are what you're seeking. The story that's looking for that is never going to ever have anything of consciousness. It gets extruded from consciousness. So consciousness is always with you. So when I talk to somebody, some people will say, hey, I'm in that place of what we call toggling, right? I'm going back and forth between where I really am in this perception of being perfectly in consciousness, and then I go into my identified place. And then a lot of times what will happen is you'll say, how can I, as this identified thing, get back there? And the reality is that's not what's going on. That's always there. So if you can say to yourself, how do I allow? Remember, the coming out part is a crystallization and contraction. When you go from undifferentiated consciousness to an individual story, which way are you going? You're going to something that's more contracted, more defined, and more glued. Absolutely. When you go back, right, the idea that you as an ego are going to get something, that's a very contracted style. I'm going to grab this and it's now going to be mine. That's the ultimate of the contracted activity of the ego identity story, right? So when we go back and try to grab consciousness, the last thing we want to do is pretend we're an ego and try to grab some consciousness thinking we're going to get anything, right? So what happens at that point is that we step into what we call the allowing. Now there's a lot of words for that. So when you say allowing or surrender is the bhakti word for it, or dispassion, those all sound like things that I do. So I want you to understand that it is simply a relaxing, right? In relaxation, the you who's all dialed in and all completely formatted and crystallized and intense, it has a tendency to fall off in relaxation. So if you'll watch yourself, you'll see that. I'll have people come to me and they'll say, Alan, I do body talk, for instance, and when I do body talk, I'm a conduit and I really feel it. But then I go and I work with my kids and my husband, and you know what happens? I completely lose it. So I need to get that back. And I'll say, go back to your body talk experience and see what happens when that conduit starts. And you're going to find that it's a relaxing openness that arises that allows that conduit to open. So the way to now deal with your kids and your husband and the rest of it is to see that you want to be a conduit in relaxation and openness in that situation as well. So that's one of the kind of practical tips, you know, James, that you can use. I'm going to give you one more. One of the first things that I do when I work with people is I try to have them hold more than one story at one time. So I'll say, I'm driving down, I used to driving down the freeway one and someone cuts you off. You guys have heard this from me a million times, but I'll use it again. So someone cuts you off, and you know, I'm from California. When someone cuts you off, that means they're a flaming asshole. That's just what that means. And we have finger signs that we give them and everything. We've got a whole thing we do when somebody cuts you off on a California freeway. It's completely required. Everybody knows the drill. This is what's going on. It's a story that Californians hold on to dearly. Trust me. You know, if you're in a car with a California driver and someone cuts them off, you absolutely will hear the same exact script that you run yourself. So it's we all hold that together. So what if I then tell you, hey, what if, you know, that guy has his young daughter in the car, and if he can get her to the emergency room in time, he's going to save her life. And you go, wow, well, if that's what's going on, forget all that other stuff. I need to do whatever I can to help that person. That's what I need to do. See, and what's happened is you forced yourself to hold two stories. You have the old story because you know that one really perfectly well, and that's the one you default to, but you never see that there's another story. So what's the other story, right? So James's question was, can you give me some techniques to maintain a conscious perspective to as we toggle back and forth? And one of the techniques is to create another story. What's the other possible story? And then create another possible story, and then create another possible story, right? So I'll use politics. I know that's the third rail that we should never talk about, but I come from a small town that probably is incredibly supportive of President Trump. That's the kind of town I come from. However, I'm sure I would be designated as a flaming liberal. I don't think anybody would, you know, miss that particular point. But it's really easy for me to understand the Trump voters because you know what? They're my folks. And so I can make up a story very easily that says this is why this is happening. Simple, no problem whatsoever. And in so doing, what happens is the identification with my flaming liberal label, it disappears. And my identification with, certainly, I probably would never wander into the Trump kind of ideology, just not my thing. So fair enough, it doesn't happen in there. But holding both of those stories takes all of the spark out of the political exercise. So when you get in your head and you're doing the political thing, and man, there's a lot of fire about it, start to go, well, okay, what about the third party voters? What do they see? You know, make up that story. What about, you know, you can make up all the different stories. As you do that, you're going to find out all of the heat, which is the glue of identification. Emotion is the glue of identification. Those stories start to dissolve the emotional identification that you have. And that's a wonderful technique as well. So seeing yourself as a conduit, knowing that you're entering into an opening situation and not a contracting situation, that's a technique you can use. Knowing that consciousness is always there, you can remind yourself of that. And you can also create stories, right? So that's another way to do that dissolution. So Donovan's question today was a question about resentment. And what he said, I'm gonna read a little bit of, if you don't mind, Donovan, just so that I can say. He says, "Say with the can you touch on resentment? say with a family member, I've had issues with them treating me in a way that's not healthy. And I've done my best to forgive them and feel peaceful around them in small quantities. And then he goes on to talk about how COVID has created that. So what he wants to know is, how about resentment? How about that? What do you do with that resentment? Resentment is an emotional feeling. Remember that, right? So I want you to focus in on this, Donovan, that the first thing you do is you do the unraveling that I talked about, right? So you and I are going to walk into multiple stories here in a minute. I'll create that for you and I, right? But then remember, I'm going to follow on with the comment about intelligence. So I want you to just track with me here for a second, okay? So let's say, because you and I come from some of the same streets, so you're going to relate to this. So you and I know this guy. He's out on Wisconsin all of the time, and basically he is a total drug addict, and he can't get off, and he is self-destructive, and that's who he is, right? He's also an incredibly lovely man. And one day you and I sit down and we start to talk about him, and we tell the story about what a wonderful man he is and all of those particular things. And then we actually move into a place where we say, I wonder how he got there. And we tell the story to each other of his life and how he got there. And we know from our experience what it's like to step into that place, right? It's not an issue. We can identify with that. So you and I are now filled with total love for this particular person, because we've told a story rather than judging him as the crack addict or the dude who's always crazy on the street or all the things that are really true. We've entered into an alternative story that allows us to be one thing with him, because our love starts to create the same love for him that we have in quantities in our consciousness itself. So that's where we arrive, right? So your family member, I'm guessing it's pretty easy to sit down, find that, and tell that story to yourself, right? So now you can get to that place where you guys are one thing. Now, what are the chances, let's use the intelligence notion, that you and I are going to go somewhere and actually hang around with someone and expose ourselves to the kind of behavior that would be damaging to us? Well, that's not very high, right? So there's an old saying that says, praise God, but remember to tether the camel, right? And the idea was, praising God's great, but when you come home, you want your camels tethered. So the same thing applies here, which is, you need to be intelligent enough not to necessarily engage and hang around with somebody in your family and expose yourself to the damage that could happen by that behavioral activity. But you can love them as though they were yourself all at the same time. You can do both of those things, right? But the first thing to do is dissolve. Resentment comes from identifying them with one story over only, right? And then getting pissed off about it. That's what resentment is. I resent the fact that that story lives like it lives. And every time I think about that story, I get pissed off about it. So what's the other story that you can tell, and other stories that you can tell, that start to dissolve that fixed piece that gives you resentment? Now you dissolve the resentment, and then you look out and go, but I can see it's probably not the most intelligent thing that I would ever do to go hang around with that guy. Right, that you and I would do, just because that's tethering the camel. So being in love and being totally connected doesn't mean that you don't act intelligently, and so those things can all live in exactly the same place. There's absolutely no problem with that. So start to work with that dissolution of story piece and see if you can. And anytime you run into that, if you ever feel emotion, that's the glue of identification. So the minute you said to me, talk about resentment, I'm going, you and I both know you can't talk about resentment without saying that's emotional. Resentment lives in the emotional space. So if it's anger, if it's whatever, it can even be pity. It can be all of those things. The emotion glues you to one story. That's its function. Now, sometimes people will then say to me, well, Alan, that sounds like emotion's a bad thing. And I will say, well, if you're moving to your original face and identity and emotion glues you to a story that you can't escape, That's not a wonderful thing, right? But when you hold a baby in your arms and are flooded with the most amazing things that you can ever believe, just because it's just pure input, it's a wonderful, beautiful thing. So emotion does have its amazing place in being human. There's nothing wrong with emotion, but like every other thing, it's consciousness itself will act like you're independent and you're your own author of your own journey, because that's what it will support. Whatever the story is, it will support. And then emotion gets in and glues you to that story. So emotion and consciousness itself will play whatever role you need it to play. So it's like everything in life. There's nothing that's all good and there's nothing that's all bad. And in fact, even in saying that, that's kind of a disservice, because in consciousness, there's no line there whatsoever. There is no good and there is no bad. There just simply is what is. And the question is, the only way to get to good and bad is living where? In the story, in the mind, in the concept. It's always going to be there. So you'll continue to see that you conflate what's in your intellect with who you are and what's happening. And the way to get out of that is to dissolve the intellect and just simply move into consciousness itself, where you're just doing perceiving. In order to perceive more than one story, to have more than one story, you have to be somewhere apart from you can't be Alan, I'm pissed off at Donovan. Like, there's just no way. That's a scene from the individual. But if I can back up and go, oh, well, there's Alan pissed off at Donovan, and there's Alan that's, holding hands with Donovan. Oh, that's cool. And there's Alan and Donovan having a cup of coffee, and there's oh, wow, all of those stories are there. Then the charge and the glue falls. And then you're seeing from consciousness itself. That's where the seeing is happening from. So we're always trying to get from the glue of individuality, or the glue of identified ego, or whatever you want to call that, to the open space that lives behind it, that extruded the first story, not knowing that it was going to get identified and glued, right? It extruded that story. So what we want to do is we want to get it back to where the perception is back here, where consciousness is, not being lived out here where the story is and thinking that's what it is. And so those are the answers to those particular questions. So here's James. Can we go beyond holding two stories and just hold many possibilities? Yes. Yes. The holding of two stories and then three stories works into this wonderful thing called curiousness. I think curiousness is the absolute bedrock of the spiritual journey. Because if you think of the purpose of consciousness itself, is to reveal itself to itself. That's its entire purpose. So if that's all consciousness is doing, is revealing itself to itself, and we don't attach meaning and the glue of identification to all of the stuff that we're seeing, it's just a revealing, then guess what? The holding of many stories is basically trying to break down that grip, that death grip on one story. But then what happens is it starts to sink in, and pretty soon it's like, wow, what's this about? Right? It becomes that kind of curiousness that you're pointing to. So and in a way, you're not even holding anything anymore. You're just like, wonder, you say, I wonder what's going to happen next, but there's actually a thing with no words whatsoever that's sitting there going, it's consciousness going, I wonder what's next, gosh, look, rain. It's 4:30 in the morning. We got thunder and lightning. Woohoo! Because that's what happened next. That we had this morning at 4:30, we all got to wake up with thunder and lightning, and probably my next door neighbor James woke up with some dog barking that went with it, because my dogs don't like that. So anyway, but that's part of the curiousness, and so even in that, so my dog gets upset, and I've got one that's really highly, I say she's a combination between a thoroughbred and a cat. I don't know how dog-like she really is, but she's very sensitive. But she loves it when you talk to her. So I got up this morning, she's distressed by the thunder and lightning. So, I talked to her and told her it was going to be okay. And we're going to hang and we're going to do all of this stuff. Probably not in any dog book at all, but that's when I talk to her, she turns her head and she loves when I talk to her, you know? So like, okay, well, that's where that possibility that James is talking about, you know, let's do something that just is obvious on the face of it, which is my dog loves it when you talk to her, and that seems to calm her down. And right now she's a little distressed with the thunder and lightning. So note that what I've done here is I've taken, speaking of the rain, it's starting again. Anyway, so if it gets too loud, you know, let me know. We may have to, sometimes we actually have to stop for a minute till the rain goes by. But you notice what I did? I took an example from 4:30 this morning, and I was able to tell a story about it, and then actually talk about a possibility that you might not normally look at, because the curiousness is there. So remember this, every single moment is an opportunity for perceiving. So we imagine ourselves walking through life. I know that's the way we imagine ourselves. If I ask you to tell me the story, well, I'm Donovan and here's what I did. Back into the experience of how it actually happens. You can go back to when you were 5 years old, and I'm 67 now. And if you can sit for a minute, you can go, huh, the same perceiving when I was 5, that looking out on stuff is the same perceiving that's happening now. There's a sense of changelessness within you when you just go back and go, oh, I am perceiving. And then what's happening, if you think about it, is life is actually marching through you. You're not marching through life, right? That's really how it happens. But then we take it and we story it and we say, oh, no, I'm an individual thing. I'm not just a perceiving, right? I'm this body mind, and this body mind is doing something within space, and I'm going to extract the story within space, and I'm going to tell the story, even though I know I can sit here and watch life move through me. For 60 something years, life has moved through me. And yet I'm able, through my conditioning, to completely ignore the fact that that's what's going on and act like I'm moving through life, because that's how I story it, and then I connect to that story, right? So here's Donovan. Is it all happening at once, but we perceive time? Okay, so this is an intellectual one. So the intellect has the ability to extend itself into time and space. And the difference between awareness and consciousness is that consciousness lives in time and space and duality. Consciousness is that extension. And who you are is the awareness and the consciousness. So the awareness is simply watching all of that, right? And then the Upanishads, there's this wonderful little piece that if you hold on to anything about how consciousness works, remember this: the spider spins its web and draws it back again. The spider is awareness, and consciousness, the principle of time and space and movement within time and space, is the web. So the web is extended and then it's pulled back again. So ultimately what you are is pure subjective or objective awareness. That's all you really are. And somewhere someone threw a quarter into the machine and we got time and space and consciousness extended so we could all watch it. And that's the story form of what's going on, right? So when we switch the story, so when I start to talk about how things march through you, I'm still talking about consciousness, but being perceived by awareness, right? So in awareness, all of that marches through you. In consciousness, we create a story that says, oh, time, space, things, there's a body, it's Alan, here's what's happening in the Alan story. And not only that, Alan's not too bright because he actually thinks that's who he is. So you get all of that, you know, as my wife likes to say, all of that in a bag of chips, you know. So consciousness is this real amazing blessing where, man, you get a whole bunch of stuff. But what you ultimately are is pure awareness, right? Not only you're pure awareness, you're unaware of yourself, right? Because there's no self to be aware of. So that's the perfect state of repose, you know, awareness that's doing no awareing. there's no movement, there's no web to actually be aware of, no need for duality, no need for a perceiver and the perceived. So that's the answer to that question. The reason I chuckled when you asked that, Donovan, is um, I have a tendency to work a lot with folks that come out of like the corporate world and that world, and so when we veer into some of these other places, those are pretty kind of, you know, esoteric and intellectual explanations. They're perfect. They explain everything and they're wonderful. But I often imagine some poor man or woman wandering into this conversation, and the time that they wander in is when that question happens, right? And thinking, oh my goodness. You know? Yeah, as opposed to when we're talking about story and how, because those are all things, you know, those are all living in consciousness. They're way more understandable. And so it's a beautiful question, and I loved every minute. And the reason I chuckled was I'm imagining this, you know, this poor soul who walked into that conversation on that question going, oh my goodness, shoot me now. So anyway, but it was a great question and incredibly relevant. Can we jump from one consciousness to another without time and space? Okay, so when you say one consciousness, you're actually talking about stories, because all there is consciousness. So if you think about it, in the world of activity, all there is consciousness. So you're always there. You don't have to worry about that. And as awareness, you're looking out on it. So those two features are always, if you will, in place. You just believe that awareness piece lives in you as an individual and in time and space, rather than seeing that it's, you know, who you are is on the outside. So a lot of times, you know, it's always funny when you hear people ask questions. They always ask questions as though they're not inside space itself, right? They're on the outside somehow asking a question about the rest of what's going on, right? So notice the formation of questions. This one's not one of them, by the way, James. You're okay on that, but I wanted to point that out because that's the typical spiritual seeker, is like going, hey, you know, I noticed that this is going on, and you're like, are you in that picture? Well, no, I'm asking the question. Yeah, put yourself in the picture, and then we'll roll from there. So basically, you know, can we jump from one consciousness to another? You're always in consciousness, right? And without time and space. So think about this for a moment. When the body mind no longer is functioning, and you and I are on that end of the conveyor belt. So that's in our near-term future. And had good news for today. Anyway, but anyway, at that particular point in time, then consciousness is no more. It's the animating piece to the body mind that you believe you are. Have you ever noticed that when the dead body passes, then consciousness itself is no longer there? Otherwise, the dead body would be still moving around. We'd have to find another way to call death, because the dead people would still be active. They'd be real zombies, in fact. So we know that that's not true. So dead people really are dead, and consciousness is no longer animating that body mind. So actually, at that point in time, you have moved out of a consciousness, and all you are is awareness, and there is no time and space, because there's no body mind out there to represent you in time and space. All the body mind is the representative of consciousness within the activity of duality. As long as it's there, it's got a view on that world. When it's not there, it's just awareness. It's just pure awareness itself. And so that's the, you know, that's what happens. That's what happens there. And one would believe. So think about how we kind of, in duality, we hold the history of the earth, if you will, or the history of humanity. Well, we know there was a time there was no humanity. We know that, you know, everything appeared and humanity appeared. And so you've got to assume, you know, a really bad author could write the end of this one, because it began somewhere, it's in full plenum now, and guess what? It's going to end. So that's the spider drawing it back again. There will become a time the earth will no longer be inhabitable, and there won't be humanity on this earth. So at that point in time, all there will be is pure awareness, unaware of itself. So that's the transition, or the movement there. I hope that all makes sense, because we got, I love, by the way, hanging in this area, Donovan, but I just, as I said, I chuckled at the fact that we're gonna do a little bit of that today. So anyway, so that's the spiritual journey. So part of this, another really cool practice is to actually play with your own perceiving. So when you have your eyes open and you sit and you're looking out on everything that is, I find that has the tendency to locate you in our conditioned belief that we are that which is looking, which is the body mind, rather than seeing that consciousness is simply looking through our eyes. So that's fine. But shut your eyes sometime and then perceive without your eyes and feel everything that's in the perceiving. And what will happen is that you will feel the perceiving from elsewhere, from nowhere, that includes you and everything else. And so you can kind of go from an open eye to a closed eye, and just imagine, just sit there and go, oh, I'm in the perceiving, and you'll feel it. You'll feel that your perceiving includes your body mind. It includes everything around it is in there. It's just the eyes have a habit of focusing you on things, and that focuses it back on you as the perceiver. When you shut your eyes, you shut that little piece off, and all of a sudden there's a difference in that perceiving. And and that's actually what meditation is, by the way. Meditation is moving one out of the perceiving from the belief that you are a separate body mind and into the perceiving from consciousness and awareness or nowhere itself. So you hear people, so in a way, be careful with meditating, because what happens to a lot of people is they say, I meditate every day. It's a wonderful device. But what happens if you do something every day? The story of you gets fully supported, right? So see meditation as a device, but don't necessarily see it as something that you do. Because what you're doing is you're writing meditation into your story, your story identity. So people will ask me, they'll say, do you meditate? And I'll just simply say, meditation actually is a device to take you to a place that replicates pure awakening. And in pure awakening, meditation is every single moment, because the perceiving is from that place. So why would you, why would you try to create a device that replicates where you already are? I don't say to Donovan, gee, Donovan, are you trying to figure out how to get to Oceanside? Donovan will go, you're nuts, I'm in Oceanside. So Donovan is not working really hard to figure out how to get to Oceanside. So if the world is being perceived from consciousness and awareness itself, don't become someone who then says, I do meditation, and try to do a device that actually locates you right where you're already located. So just see that for some people, Osho used to talk about how humility was a more dangerous attribute than pride, because a lot of religious people use humility to basically take a position of power in our world, right? I'm the most humble saint there ever was. Okay, there you go. That sounds pretty powerful to me. We should all stop and listen to you, shouldn't we? It's an individuated story. So watch what meditation has. All of these devices are simply devices. So when James said, can we go from two stories and hold many possibilities? I was really happy he asked that question, because I was able to take a device and then march to the place it naturally is going to go. So drop the device. Buddha used to say that you take the boat across the river, and when you get there, don't put that bad boy on your back and haul it across the rest of your terrain. Leave the boat on the shore. Use the device for what it's helpful for, and then move into the space that it's delivered to you. So that becomes that becomes that particular piece. All right, man. Those are good questions. Thank you, guys. That was excellent, excellent. Carolyn jumped in the middle of all this, which is awesome. And I'm hoping she got here in time to kind of figure out what we were doing with story and using story to dissolve things. And that's it. Are there any other questions? I feel like you know what, we're a little early today, but in 50 minutes we pounded it out pretty good today. We did a real. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you. So I think we did a really good job in a short period of time. So everybody is good. No more questions. All right. My suggestion to you is, if you get a chance, if anybody needs it, I've been reading the pointers. So's Donovan. I think James has pointers, and Carol, exactly. So you can see it. Donovan's holding it up. For some reason, I don't know why, that particular book right now, a lot of people are reading, and it's really working well. I've been rereading it again. I have a tendency to read that one every now and then. Exactly. The best part of the whole book is I forget what it's called. It's in the appendix, and it's like the basic understanding or something. And so the first time I read it, I read this thing and I said to myself, this might be the best writing I've ever seen in the spiritual world. And it's stuck in the appendix. Like, how many people read a book and never read the appendix? I'll bet you half the people that read that book have never read that piece. So don't miss the basic understanding in the appendix. It's the best. It's I think it's about 6 or 8 pages long. It is the absolute perfect rendition of the story end to end. It's just, and Ramesh wrote it about what he saw that Nisargadatta was doing. And if you knew Ramesh and you knew Nisargadatta, you'd laugh, because it really reflects them both in a little bit of a different way. So that really was as much Ramesh's in my mind as it was Nisargadatta, even though, like I say, those individuals don't matter. It's all just moving through. They were just conduits for what wanted to happen, but it's really good. So my suggestion, just for no other reason, is if you're reading that book, keep it up. Remember, it's one of those books, it'll catch you by surprise. It's easy to read, but it's really dense. So you can read it a whole bunch if you want to, but it's a really great read. So, all right, everybody. I love you all. Thank you for being here. I'll see you at the next one in 2 weeks. Remember, there is a European edition that comes at about noon your time every other Friday. So a week from Friday, we'll be doing the European edition if you want to jump in on that one. What's fun there is a lot of times the kids get in and ask me questions. So if you want to see a 7 and an 11 and a 13-year-old ask me questions, you can watch that. It's hilarious to talk to somebody who is in the process of being conditioned. It creates a whole different conversation. It's a lot of fun because they know it. They're the one thing I never realized, because I would look back on my own life, was how intimately aware I must have been that was going on. Because when you talk to these kids, they're going, yeah, that's what's happening. They're telling me stuff, and I can feel that it's not wrong, but I've no one that ever would support me in that, so I have to crush it and bury it. And you see the activity of these kids being taught to grab onto one story, and they know it's happening. It's awesome. So if you get a chance to come on down to that. All right, everybody. I love you. I will see you at the next event. Bye.